All right, so now that we have our test contextual message appearing and disappearing, the next step is going to be to create an actual trigger for it to replace our test code here. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete the test code for the time being because we know that's working. And then let's head into the Unity editor. And I'm going to exit 2D mode because we're going to need to work back in the 3D editor. And I'll double click my floor to kind of get back into the world of my game. And I'm going to create a ProBuilder cube to represent my trigger volume. So the hotkey for a new shape is Control-Shift-K. And I'm going to just go ahead and build a cube. You'll notice like the new shape appears way out in oblivion. So maybe it's a better idea if I focus the camera on my player and then hit Control-Shift-K. It'll start my cube a little closer to the play area here. So I just hit build on a 111 cube here, and I've got my pro grids set on a 1 meter grid. I'm going to switch to the Y grid down there so I can see it on the floor. And I'm going to move this box down kind of in front of my player. If everything is going according to plan, your grid will match your ProBuilder material. If not, something isn't on the grid, so you could try clicking on your floor and clicking snap to grid and clicking on your cube and hit snap to grid, and hopefully that'll fix it for you. It's a good idea to keep everything on the grid as you work. Now, the neat thing about ProBuilder, well, first what I'm going to do is just let's make this what's soon to be a trigger volume. Let's make it a little larger so that it's easier to bump into. That's pretty good. And then let's raise it up. Thing with triggers in game design is I think you want to make them, you don't want to try and make them, and this is a weird example because this is just a big empty test level, but in a real level, you want to make the triggers big enough that there's no doubt the player's going to hit it. And I'd rather be too big than too small. You don't want some weird case where they can somehow get past the trigger without hitting it when you were intending for a situation where the player has to hit that trigger. And really the only time situations like that can go wrong is if you had, like, say, a multi-floor level and you made your trigger so tall that it was popping up through the second floor, and then the player was triggering it when they were upstairs and it was only meant to happen downstairs. So with triggers, a lot of times I'll extend them like down into the geometry a little bit, like the floor, the wall. You just want to double check it's not popping out into the next room or the next floor. I'm just mentioning that now for posterity. There's no, this situation is very, vanilla. There's no multiple floors or rooms. Anyway, the cube at this point, let's rename it to message trigger, and I'm going to make sure I'm back in object mode. I was using face selection to make my trigger bigger, and there's a neat function in ProBuilder called set trigger. You might notice set collider. What this one will do is make it like, this is useful for invisible collision, which you need to use a lot to like keep your player in bounds, so to speak. This one, set trigger, gives it a neat transparent material and automatically sets the is trigger checkbox on the collider here. So that's a pretty useful function in ProBuilder. I use it a lot. Now, one thing you should keep in mind, we haven't really done this in this example, but if you start making like more complex shapes, your triggers do have to have convex collision meshes. So you can't make like a really complicated trigger volume. It still basically needs to be a convex shape like a box. So it's good for making a very specific shaped box, which is annoying with a regular Unity volume, but this will let you keep your triggers nicely aligned with the grid, etc., but don't get any ideas of making like L-shaped triggers and things like that. All right, so the other thing this set trigger button does is it puts a little trigger behavior script that comes with ProBuilder onto our object. And what that does is it hides the renderer when I run the game. So if I hit play, that little volume goes away visually, but you can see it is still present in the scene. If I double click it and look at scene view, you can see it's there. It's just invisible. So that's, pretty much the ideal behavior you want for a trigger, except when we're just testing stuff, we may not want the visual representation of the trigger to go away, because even though ultimately the player is not meant to see that, I need to see it to be able to test, because my situation is so open-ended. It'd be difficult for me to figure out exactly where that was. So I'm going to uncheck manage visibility for the time being, so that when I run the game, I can still see the trigger in my game window. So that's a temporary measure that we will want to, undo once our game is ready to send to players. All right, so next, let's go ahead and just make a basic script to control this thing. So I'm going to go to create C# script, and I'm going to name this thing contextual message trigger. All right, and before I forget, we can go ahead and drag our contextual message trigger onto this game object. So you can see there it is. And I think this is a decent chunk of work, so let's stop this video and, well, actually, let's make our commit first, right? That's our habit we're trying to get into. So I'm on my correct branch where I'm working on this feature, and we'll say added a trigger volume to scene and created basic script. I don't know. So there we go. This is just incremental progress. You want to make probably more commits that are smaller chunks of work in case you ever need to go back to a previous version. You have like a longer history of save points, as opposed to like doing tons of work in one giant chunk. Then if something were to be, if you discover a bug was introduced in that ton of work, it's going to be tougher to like undo just a little bit of the work because you've done so much at once. It may be tougher to even debug to begin with. You have to go through. You may be able to quickly revert this one and test, still has the bug, revert this one and test, still has the bug, revert this one and test. Oh wait, the bug's fixed. Now you know something about this change introduced a bug. If you only have a few things that changed here, it's easy to pinpoint what is the problem. But if you have a billion things here, it's still going to be annoying. So anyway, I recommend that you make lots of smaller commits. I'm going to push this thing and we will stop the video. All right, so I just realized a problem here. I said that I added the trigger volume to the scene, which I did. However, I neglected to save. This little asterisk here shows you if you have unsaved changes. So if I look at my commit history carefully, I can see I did not commit the scene file. So that's kind of a failure. I already pushed this, so rather than wipe out that commit and try again, let's just make a new commit on top of it. It's not a big deal. So we'll just make sure we actually save the scene, and then we will go to Unity and we can have some explanation. Oops. All right. So anyway, just wanted to catch that before I forgot.